Thank you. And thank all of you for your financial support and your prayer support. Some of you prayed for me personally 8 or 9 years ago as I went through an interesting time medically, and I'm glad to be back to visit. I haven't seen many of you since that time. But the Sanger Center for Compassion operates the program Quincy Crisis Center. We renamed our agency the Sanger Center in honor of Esther Sanger, who started the agency. She wasn't happy that we changed the name because she was a humble woman, but we felt that we wanted to do that just before she passed away. But I met Esther when I was in college. She was back in college. She was the age I am now, only I wasn't the age I am now. And she went back to school. She felt like God had redirected her life to do something different with her life. I love nurses. They saved my life. She was a nurse, but she felt she wanted to get into the helping field. I thought she was in the helping field, but she started to post her phone number all around town. Need a friend, call Esther, and her home phone number. In crisis, call Esther, and her home phone number. I have no idea what kind of calls she would get these days. But back then, her phone started ringing. And she came out of her medical experience feeling like God had called her to respond to the least of the least. From Jesus' words, not just to the least of my brothers, but to the least of the least, those that no program was serving. And so we have continued that sense of mission. The simplest statement of our mission is to advance a culture of compassion. And so our mission is kind of two-pronged. It's to meet the needs of those who are kind of falling through the safety net, falling through the cracks in the system, as well as to engage the community in meeting those needs. And so, I can be honest and stand before you and say, I don't do anything to meet those needs. I connect you to those needs, and you meet those needs. And that's really what our role is at the Sanger Center. That same phone number, 617-471-7075, continues to ring with people calling, looking for a friend. It's no longer Esther answering the phone. Sometimes it's me, sometimes it's a volunteer, sometimes it's another staff person. And we get all kinds of calls. A few years ago, we got a call from a woman in her early 30s, and she said, I was just diagnosed with MS. I've been struggling for 4 or 5 years. It's rapidly progressing. It's early onset kind of thing, and I just don't know where to get help. And so we worked with her. And now our services to her primarily, as she's been connected with us for several years, is we provide food deliveries to her. Esther early on started doing food deliveries to people. They'd call asking for help. They needed food. And I can remember her hitting up professors for money. I thought you give professors money and maybe that will help. But she would ask them for money after class. Can I have $5? Can I have $5? I have to buy groceries for a family in need. And so she would take food out. Well, now we have volunteers who make food deliveries across the South Shore to people who cannot get to a food pantry but need some kind of food assistance. This mother that we've been working with for a while, her kids are now well into their teens and eat a lot of food. And in addition to that, she has few good days. And we don't want her to take her good days to have to go wait in line at a food pantry. So we deliver to her on her bad days so that she can celebrate and enjoy her good days. So a variety, that's just one household. There are a lot of families we serve just once or twice, either through the hotline or through the food pantry, through some of our other programs. People will get called from visiting nurses. This person just got out of the hospital and a rehab facility. They've been away from their home for 8 weeks. What's in their refrigerator can't be eaten. Can you get food to them today? And then as they get their life together, a lot of situations like that. We get caseworkers who call and other people who call. What you have done in terms of supporting us financially has allowed us to reach out to people who often have nowhere else to turn, or if they don't know where to turn, they can call us and get that good referral through our hotline and get that direction. Is it the Great Hall? My parents, we call their house the Great Room. Okay. I've been exposed. But we call my parents' house, we built a room for them. It's the Great Room. But I'll be in the Great Hall. I can tell you more about some of the families that we serve and ways that you can connect. But I really want to come and say thank you for your support. Pretty much dollar for dollar, the money that comes in, just the food that we distribute, is worth more than what we raise each year in terms of the value of the food that we distribute. So we have access to food and food drives and those kinds of things. So we're very efficient with your gifts but we certainly need, and I'm not putting pressure on you, but in general, we certainly need more than is presently coming in. So if you would keep that as pray for me as I write grant requests and as I do that kind of thing. But I really came to thank you, and I'll meet with you in the Great Hall, and I'll not break anything else.
Our scripture lesson this morning comes from a book. This is the first book of Proverbs, that I ever read anything from when I was a boy, because I could understand it. I searched through and I found pithy little sayings that were practical and earth-centered, and they made sense to me, because much of the Bible as a boy did not. And so that has stuck with me. And today we're going to be focusing on wisdom in the Old Testament or the Hebrew Scriptures. There are several books of the Hebrew Scriptures that are dedicated just to the pursuit of wisdom. They're called wisdom literature. So we're turning to chapter 8, verses 32 to 36. Now, my children, listen to me. Happy are those who keep my ways. Hear instruction and be wise, and do not neglect it. Happy is the one who listens to me, watching daily at my gates, waiting beside my doors. For whoever finds me finds life and obtains favor from the Lord. But those who miss me injure themselves, and all who hate me love death. Here ends our reading of God's holy word for us. We invest a great deal in the education of our children, whether we're parents of children now or as a church. It has a broader interest in the lives of our young people. We want them to do well in school so that they can have a brighter future. We know it's a key that unlocks many doors. We provide then also all sorts of other opportunities and activities to help enrich their lives. Some parents say to me, I feel more like a chauffeur than a parent, and yet that's an integral part of being a parent today, isn't it? But there's an elusive quality that we also want for them. It may go unnamed, and it's not so easy to know how to define or even provide. I'll call it wisdom. Listen to this 6-year-old. When scary thoughts come into my head, like a witch or a monster or a bully or a burning house, I pretend it's like a photo album, and I turn the pages until I get a picture I like. That's pretty wise. That's wisdom. Now imagine if all of us could learn from this child. We may not be invaded by images of witches, monsters, but what about our constant inner chatter? All too often negative, sometimes even toxic. We spend a lot of money sometimes on therapy, medication, to help make that go away. But this child offers something that works, and it's free. He's in touch with something bigger than himself. 6 years old. May his tribe increase. The Bible speaks of wisdom with great reverence, often referred to as feminine, as she. She is more precious than jewels, it says in another passage in Proverbs. She's always there as one of the faces of God. And yet we sang our opening hymn about the Trinity, and she's not mentioned specifically, but she's there. Always there as one of the faces of God, and yet is strangely elusive. Now, some wisdom isn't just from children, it also comes from adults. And I'd like us to hear the words of Thomas Merton, the late Thomas Merton, Trappist, monk, and author. Our Christian destiny is, in fact, a great one. A great one. But we cannot achieve greatness unless we lose all interest in being great. That's not something we can take for ourselves. It has to be given to us. For our own idea of greatness is illusory. Isn't that interesting? Our own understanding of greatness is illusory. When we are truly ourselves, we lose most of the futile self-consciousness that keeps us constantly comparing ourselves with others in order to see how big we are. And that comes from his book, No Man is an Island. We cannot achieve greatness unless we lose all interest in being great. God has programmed each of us for greatness. It's just that we usually have it all wrong. For it is when we are weak that we are strong, even though we don't grasp that easily, don't want to. But it's only at those times when we have the best chance of being strong as Jesus was strong, and that's the rub, isn't it? Jesus just doesn't make it in most boardrooms of political battles, from Wall Street all the way to our family discussions, ironically, because he embodied this wisdom, and that kind of wisdom is disruptive. Right before our eyes, but it's difficult to live, difficult to do. What's so frustrating about God's wisdom is it seems to be hidden. Why couldn't God just spell it out clearly so we could see it without ambiguity, and then we'd all know? But God might say, I already have. You just have to work at it a little bit because I'm speaking in a different language than the current common language in our societies. This wisdom is often paradoxical in nature, and we have to remove ourselves from the center of our concerns before we can really begin to see. But we don't often like to live like that, or like we believe that. Somewhere inside of us, we know that it's okay for us to want to be great or to be comfortable or to be well thought of, and we fear that if we don't want it badly enough and work at it hard enough, it won't happen. It'll pass us by. But Merton reminds us of God's ways of doing things. Greatness isn't something we seek or chase down or grab and cling to. Rather, it's something that we tend to discover as already being within us, temporarily hidden from our eyes, but intended to be discovered. Intended to be discovered. See? A father and his 5-year-old son were passing through customs after an international trip. And the suitcase is up on the table, and the customs official, very officious, as they're going through all the items in the suitcase, and the little 5-year-old standing off to the side, and you can just tell he's getting more and more nervous as the official's picking things up, looking here and there. And finally, he's satisfied, he puts everything back, zips up the suitcase and says, "Sir, you can go." The little boy couldn't contain himself, and he says, Daddy, he didn't find it." Some things are hidden and are meant to stay that way. But the wisdom of God is wrapped up in the stuff of life, isn't it? And is very much meant to be found. May God help us with our blindness. A more practical application. Whenever you make practical applications of things you think are examples of wisdom, you create controversy. So I'm going to go back in history 150 years. The movie Lincoln, starring Daniel Day-Lewis and Sally Field as the President and Mrs. Lincoln, focused only on the last 4 months of Lincoln's life. I didn't know that, but it was in a very intense period. And the movie really was gripping. And those 4 months really focused on two huge issues. The ending of the brutal war that had been so costly to both sides, and the passage of the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery. In January of 1865, Lincoln insists on having it brought before the House for action. It had already passed the Senate. And everyone, it seems, thinks he's crazy. His Secretary of State, Seward, is adamantly opposed because he, like the rest of the Republicans, Lincoln's own party, knows that the necessary votes just aren't there. He's committing political suicide. What's he thinking? Lincoln explains himself. When he issued the Emancipation Proclamation 2 years earlier in 1863, it was a wartime action within the powers allotted to the president. But once the war was over, the proclamation would be automatically rescinded. Lincoln's concern was after the South surrendered, which he believed was inevitable, the slavery issue might come up as a bargaining chip. It might become subject to some kind of negotiation, and with both sides weary from the conflict, exhausted, financially depleted, almost anything could happen. Moreover, Lincoln knew that in that very month of January, delegates from both North and South had been meeting secretly, seeking to work out terms of peace and spare any more bloodshed. That was the tack that Seward wanted to see him go in. If the 13th Amendment, though, were voted up by the House, the South would then cease negotiations and the war would continue. Lincoln was a professional politician. He was smart. He was clever, employing crafty means to work on getting the necessary votes in the House. And both his fellow Republicans and the Democrats were also very able political animals as well. And the movie portrays some of the negotiating and other things that are, it isn't easy to watch that. Someone once said that two things you really don't want to know the details about how they're created: sausage and laws. If you're sitting in the back smoke-filled room and you understand all the negotiating, the compromise, and the payoffs that go on, you'd say, what a country. What a country. Lincoln fights them on their own terms. And he holds his own, but he can't do it alone. But he's also speaking to the issue, as I see it, of wisdom. As portrayed in the movie, the abolishing of slavery was a profoundly moral issue for him. He's willing to risk a potentially damaging political defeat in order to ensure that abolishment has a chance of becoming part of the bedrock, the foundation, the bricks of the nation he so loves. An amendment to the Constitution would do that. A smarter politician probably wouldn't have taken the risk. But Lincoln could do no other, much to the frustration of his closest advisors. When sitting with the secret Confederate delegation, the issue of slavery was brought up for negotiation, and Lincoln made it absolutely clear. He just looked at them and stated simply, forcefully, "Gentlemen, slavery is over." They're shocked, they're angry, and they go home, knowing that the war must continue to its bitter conclusion. Wisdom isn't just the collected witticisms of someone like Benjamin Franklin. Franklin, as helpful and as inspiring as his words can be. Wisdom, in the sense intended here, has everything to do with God. It humbles us all We do not possess wisdom. It possesses us when we let it. One of the wisest things Lincoln ever said, and I mentioned it last week, was, "Mr. President, do you think God's on your side?" And he said, "I'm much more concerned about whether I'm on God's side." That's a wise thing to say. He was a theologian at that point, and he was challenging current common wisdom with something bigger. We don't own God. We don't control God. It's the other way around. Lincoln's commitment to wisdom as he perceived it caused him to risk his second term, which he never got to live out, and it cost him, I believe, his life. He certainly wasn't a perfect man or an ideal president in many ways. He would find it very difficult to serve in that capacity today in 2013. The acrimony would be similar. He would recognize it. The issues would be different. And he would have intense enemies now, just as he did then. But he's one of the most revered figures in U.S. history, if not the most. Not because of his smarts, cleverness, or backroom craftiness, but I believe because of his soulfulness. Somehow, at several critical points, he was able to transcend and see the bigger picture. You don't have to agree with his conclusions, but I'm talking about his sense of the bigger picture. Despite all the heartache and bitterness that flowed through the country when the war ended, he flew in the face of those who wanted to cruelly punish the South and said, in the last paragraph of his second inaugural address, very famous words, "With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan." He doesn't say north or south. "To do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations." Wise words. Many people in the North thought that the crisis had ended at Appomattox, but Lincoln knew better. Both sides had suffered so much that mutual hatred ran deep. Lincoln knew that this toxic waste was more deadly than bullets and cannonballs. And so his words were an expression of badly needed wisdom at a critical time in our country's history to a bleeding and wounded nation. He would die just over a month later, but we still remember those words. They have staying power. Clever words can fire us up, but they don't usually last. Crafty strategies may win big at the time, but those victories can often be shallow and short-lived. But wisdom is precious. It's elusive. It's all too rare. But she's out there, and she's in here. We just have to learn to stop striving so hard to grasp her and let her find us.